Hello, good afternoon. So today we are going to talk about moral philosophy. More specifically, we are going to talk about the views of two 18th century philosophers about morality, reason, and the passions. We are going to talk about and compare the views of the Scottish philosopher David Hume and the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, who both lived in the 18th century. Before I start, let me just say a couple of things about what moral philosophy is about. So, moral philosophy is concerned about questions of right and wrong, but besides being concerned with exactly what actions are right and what actions are wrong, moral philosophy is also concerned about what it is that make actions right and wrong, and what is the source of moral action and moral thinking. So all of these may sound very general and abstract to you right now, but it's okay. We will, I think you will see more what I mean here when we get into the details of Hume and Kant's philosophy. So let us just so I'm going to talk about Hume first, and then I'll talk about Kant's view on morality, and you will see that the two of them have very different views. In fact, it is probably not too far-fetched to say that their views are in many ways diametrically opposite. So let's start with David Hume. So David Hume is a Scottish philosopher who lived in the 18th century, specifically from 1711 to 1776. Now, one way to quickly summarize Hume's views on morality is to say that for Hume, reason is the slave of the passions. Okay, this might not mean very much to you right at this very moment, but let me just get into the details real quick, and then things will become very, very clear soon enough. All right, so reason is the slave of the passions. How do we explain this? What does this mean? Well, let's start with talking about Hume's basic view of human beings. So Hume basically believes that for human beings, there are two things that that are operative in our minds. The first thing is reason, and the second thing is sentiment or passion. So reason is whatever it is that allows us. Reason is basically that part of us, is that part of our mind that allows us to find out things about the world and find out things about certain ideas. So, for example, reason is the part of my mind that enables me to do mathematics, that enables me to know that 2 plus 2 equals 4, for example. It is also that part of the mind that allows me to organize my senses in such a way as to do science and to find out about the world around me. So basically, you can say that reason is the part of the mind that is the processing, calculative, and fact-gathering part of your mind. Now, the passion or sentiment is the part of your mind that represents things as pleasurable or painful, as nice or not nice, as good or bad. Is the part of your mind that that represents things as being desirable or not desirable, and which drives you to action based on that representation. So an example would be, I find chocolate to be pleasurable. The very thought of chocolate makes me salivate. So my finding chocolate to be pleasurable and desirable, and thus being driven to eat chocolate, is an example of a passion or sentiment. So Hume believes that we have, there are certain sentiments or passions or even tastes that are universally ingrained in us by nature. So it is more or less universally ingrained in us by nature to find certain kinds of music pleasing to the ear. It is also ingrained in us by nature to find chocolate pleasing. I mean, it is true that some of us find chocolate more pleasing than others, but it is more or less universal. You would be hard pressed to find somebody who thinks chocolate is is painful. So Hume, long story short, Hume actually believes that there are certain things that that we are ingrained by nature to universally find pleasurable or painful. If I were to step onto a if we were to step on step our foot against the wall or step on a nail, we are all universally ingrained to find that sensation to be painful. So there are all these universal, sentiments or passions that are more or less hardwired in us by nature. And okay, here's what's really interesting. Hume believes that just as there are things that are just as there are physical things that we are hardwired to find pleasurable or unpleasurable or painful, there are also certain moral things that we are hardwired to find, that are hardwired in us, so that we find universally painful or pleasurable. For example, if Hume believes that if you see somebody doing a good deed, you will find that it is universally ingrained in us to find to see the sight of somebody doing a good deed as to be pleasurable. So if we were to see somebody helping a blind person cross the road, it is universally ingrained in us to find that, to find the sight, or to find that kind of moral phenomena to be pleasurable. Similarly, if you were to see a child drowning in a pond, it is universally ingrained in you to find that to be displeasurable, or painful, and it is universally ingrained in you to want to, do something to pull the child out of the water or something like that. If you don't have that sentiment, then there's a good chance that that you are a psychopath and there's something wrong with you. So, long story short, what I'm trying to say is that Hume believes that just as there are universal tastes that allow us to find things like chocolate to be universally pleasurable, there's also a universal moral taste, or sorry, universal moral sentiment that causes us to universally find certain things to be morally pleasant and other things to be morally repulsive. So it is the universal moral sentiment that hardwires us to find the sight of somebody helping a blind person cross the road to be pleasurable, pleasing to the moral sense, and to also find the sight of a child drowning to be painful to the moral sense, so that we are impelled by our moral sense to do something about it. So what Hume is basically saying is that, if you are following all this so far, what Hume is basically saying is that morality, human morality, is very much a matter of sentiment or passion or feeling. We can only be moved to do moral things or immoral things because of certain moral sentiments that we have. The reason by itself cannot really move us to do anything. Reason by itself can tell us that, look, there is a child that's drowning over there, but unless you have that moral sentiment, you won't feel anything, and if you don't feel anything, you won't be moved to do anything. But most of us are moved to do something, at least call the police. So most of us have that moral sentiment which moves us to help people, to do moral things. And Hume believes that this is why morality is ultimately a matter of feeling or passion. Without feeling or passion, without moral feeling or moral passion, there can be no morality. So this is, so if you look at it this way, Hume's view is actually quite straightforward and quite intuitive, quite easy to understand. So let me just repeat this. So Hume believes that it is moral sentiment, not reason, that moves us to action. And this is clear from the example of the drowning child. It is your feeling of sympathy for the drowning child that moves you to do something to pull the child out of the water. So what that means is that reason can only tell us facts about the world. It can, in the case of the drowning child, for example, it can also tell us about the means, the tools that are available to do the right action. So, for example, in the case of the drowning child, reason will tell us that you have to run over to the pool, jump in order to pull the child out. You have to probably take off your shoes so that you can swim better to pull the child out. But reason by itself, so reason by itself can supply you with the tools, with the instruments to do what needs to be done. But reason cannot tell you what needs to be done. Only passion can move you towards the right action. So again, and this is why Hume believes that ultimately reason is a slave of the passions, because ultimately when it comes to moral action, it is the passions that really move you to do the thing that needs to be done. The reason is like a servant or a slave of the passion, in that it tells you, it pinpoints to you what action needs to be taken. You need to jump into the pool, you need to take off your shoes, for example. But reason by itself doesn't actually move you to action. It gives you the tools, it tells you what needs to be done, but it is actually passion that is the master. It is passion that is actually moving you. Okay, so long story short, that is Hume's view about morality. We all have a universal moral sentiment hardwired into us, and it is this moral sentiment that is really moving us to action, and reason is basically just a tool that helps us to pinpoint the right action to be taken. Alright, so let us move on to the other philosopher that we're going to talk about today, Kant. So Immanuel Kant is a German philosopher who lived from 1724 to 1804. So as you can see, he lived at the same time as Hume. He's a contemporary. Now Kant's view is very interesting, and in some ways also very complicated. Kant begins his famous groundwork for the metaphysics of morals by talking about the importance of goodwill. He says that there is nothing in this world, or even out of it, that is of unqualified and unconditional value except for the goodwill. So he believes that having a goodwill is very important. However, this is it's a little bit misleading, because he's not saying by saying that goodwill is important, he's not saying that feelings are important. In fact, he believes that feelings or sentiments are actually very unreliable. So in this sense, he's actually very much disagreeing with Hume. Why are they unreliable? Now think about this. So if you have a moral feeling, if you have certain feelings of sympathy towards people, sometimes those feelings of sympathy might move you to do morally right actions. Like for example, when you see if you see a drowning child, the moral feeling or the moral sentiment will move you. The feeling of sympathy will move you to pull the child out of the water. But sometimes our feeling of sympathy can also get us to do the wrong thing. For example, maybe you have a friend who is trying to cheat on an exam, and your feeling of sympathy for the friend, maybe you want your friend to pass the exam, to do well in the exam, so your feeling of sympathy for your friend might actually lead you to cover up for your friend, or maybe even help your friend to cheat. So you can see that the same feeling of sympathy can lead in some cases to doing the right action, but in some cases it can also lead to doing the morally wrong action. So because of this, Kant believes that feelings are ultimately unreliable, because depending on what the situation is, depending on where your feelings are pulling you, they can lead you in very different directions in different situations. So feelings are unreliable. So because of this, Kant believes that ultimately, in order to be moral, we need to be guided by reason, or more precisely, we need to be guided by this, we need to be guided by this moral law, and we need to be guided by certain notions of duty, and these notions of duty would result in certain commands of reason that we have to follow as rational beings. Okay, so what does all this mean? Let me say something about the commands of reason that Kant is talking about first. So he calls the commands of reason imperatives, which is a fancy word for command. So Kant believes that ultimately there are two kinds of imperatives. There are what he calls hypothetical imperatives, and categorical imperatives. Now, let's just start by talking about hypothetical imperatives first. So, to say that something is a hypothetical imperative is to say that it is a command of reason that only applies to you in the event that you have certain desires. In other words, it only applies to you in the hypothetical situation that you have certain desires. Here's an example. So suppose you want to get fit. In that case, you ought to go to the gym. So in that case, a hypothetical imperative would apply to you. It would be something like, if you want to get fit, you ought to go to the gym. If you want to get fit, then you ought to go to the gym. Or maybe you're on a diet. If you want to lose weight, you ought to eat less sweets or something like that. So you can see that hypothetical imperatives are imperatives that apply to you only if you have certain desires. Okay. Now, on the other hand, there are, in addition to hypothetical imperatives, there's what Kant calls categorical imperatives. Now, categorical imperatives, the word categorical means absolutely, without exception, no matter what. So, a categorical imperative is something that applies to you as a rational being, no matter what desires you may or may not have. Here's an example of a categorical imperative according to Kant. So, an example of a categorical imperative would be, you ought never to lie, or you ought never to break a promise. Now, you're probably thinking to yourself right now, why? I mean, why is it that a moral law, why is it that a moral duty is a categorical imperative? I mean, why is it that a categorical imperative, why is it that moral laws like never steal, or why is it that moral commandments like never steal or never lie would be things that apply to me no matter what as a rational being? This is the interesting question. So Kant has a very interesting system to show us that, to show us why moral commandments are things that apply to us as rational beings, are things that we have to follow as rational beings, insofar as we are rational beings. So this is how Kant goes on to prove the categorical imperative. Now Kant believes that there is a way to prove that moral commands or requirements of morality are laws that apply to us as rational beings, no matter what other desires we may have. And this is one. There are a few ways he goes about proving this, but there is. I'm just going to talk about one particular way he tries to prove this, and this is how. He says that moral laws like don't steal or don't lie or don't break promises. All these laws are such that they cannot be broken, because if you break them, then you will be committing a very serious contradiction as a rational being. Okay, how? Well, let me. Okay, so here's one way he tries to prove this. He says that now think of moral law as a universal law. Okay, now so here's one way he formulates the categorical imperative. He says you should act only on that maxim. Maxim means subjective principle. So you should act only on that subjective principle, whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. Or to put it in plain English, it means that you should never do anything unless you can visualize or imagine a universe in which everybody is also doing that thing. Okay, so how does that apply to morality? Well, here's how. Okay, this sounds reasonable enough. Let's try to apply this to morality. Okay, suppose we think about breaking a promise. Suppose you are very poor and you just borrowed some money from somebody, but you have no intention of returning the money. So in other words, you promise somebody that you're going to return the money, but you have no intention of returning that money. In other words, you are thinking of breaking a promise that you kept. So imagine a universe in which nobody keeps promises. Imagine a universe in which promises are broken all the time. Actually, that sounds like our universe. But anyway, imagine a universe in which promises are broken all the time. Um, what would happen in such a universe? Well, in a universe in which promises are broken all the time, very very soon nobody would even know what a promise is anymore, because the whole point of a promise is the whole point of the institution of promise keeping is that a promise is like a contract that has to be honored. If nobody honors contracts, if nobody keeps promises, then promises will become meaningless. So the idea of a lying promise, the idea of a promise to be broken is actually a contradiction, because the idea of lying or the idea of not keeping the promise actually negates the very concept of a promise. So breaking a promise is an example of a contradiction in conception. It is a contradiction in conception because it is impossible to have a concept of a lying promise, because the lying actually cancels out the very institution of promise keeping. So because of this, Kant believes that it is never possible to have a universe in which everybody breaks promises. And if it is impossible to have a universe in which everybody breaks promises, and if we are supposed to ask ourselves whether our action can be an action in which everybody does in a particular universe, then the answer is no. Breaking a promise cannot be an action which everybody takes in a particular universe, because in that universe there will be no such thing. Pretty soon there will be no such thing as a promise. So you see that breaking a promise is something that cannot be universally undertaken in a universe. So if you use this as a test, then you will see that this breaking a promise doesn't pass this universalizability test. So breaking a promise cannot be universalized, and according to Kant, if it cannot be universalized, then it is something that ought not to be done. Because if you do it, then you are committing a contradiction. Then you are not a reasonable being anymore. So, long story short, by asking yourself whether an action can be universalized, you are actually asking yourself whether an action goes against reason. And Kant would say that breaking a promise goes against reason because it contradicts the very idea of a lying promise. Is a self-contradiction. It's a contradiction in terms. So you see that this is actually very brilliant. What Kant has done is to actually come up with a system of duties based on reason alone. And based on this idea of the universalizability test or the categorical imperative, Kant actually comes up with a system of duties which he divides into perfect duties and imperfect duties. So an example of a perfect duty is the duty to never break promise. You should never break a promise, because a universe in which everybody breaks promises would be a universe in which there are no more promises. So it's a self-contradiction. So therefore, you have a perfect or an absolute duty to never break promises. But there are also certain duties that are imperfect duties. They are imperfect because they are duties that should be done, but there is a lot of flexibility about how they should be done. So here's an example. You have a duty to help other people. It is an imperfect duty because it's possible to think of a universe in which nobody ever helps anybody. I mean, in that universe, everybody will still survive. But I think that in that universe, people will be a little bit worse off than in this universe, because if nobody, as a rational being that's living in the world, we often will need other people's help in order to do the things that we need to do. I mean, just a simple example. If you want to go to the store to buy something, you need the help of the cashier to help you to check out your whatever it is that you're buying. So this simple example tells us that a universe in which nobody ever helps anybody else, in which there's no cooperation, would be a universe that is probably worse off than the universe we live in. So because of that, we have an imperfect duty. We have a duty to help other people, it is imperfect because it can never be precisely stated who you need to help and how much you need to help, but we need to do our best to help people whenever we can. So we have an imperfect duty to do things like help other people, and maybe also develop our skills and talents. And we have perfect duties to never do certain things, such as lie or break promises or steal. So after talking about all this, you can probably see that there's a certain beauty to Kant's moral philosophy. In fact, it probably is it's probably not an exaggeration to say that by coming out with his moral philosophy, Kant has brought about a revolution in moral philosophy. Why is it a revolution? Well, because he has come up with a way to explain why certain things need to be done, why you need to keep promises and why you should never steal and lie and all that. He has come out with a way to talk about to explain to us why we need to do all of those things without basing it on feeling or on religious doctrine. Because before Kant came along, a lot of our morality is based on what we learn from our religion, our religious background. And so Kant is saying that actually you don't actually need to have a religious background in order to know why you need to be a moral person. Reason alone can tell you why you need to be a moral person. If you subject everything to the universalizability test, if you subject everything to the categorical imperative, you will have a system that can perfectly tell you what you need to do as a reasonable being, and you will basically tell you that as a reasonable being you need to behave morally, because if you don't, then you're not reasonable. So the revolution is that Kant has come up with a system that bases morality on reason alone and not on feelings or religious doctrine. And I think this is a wonderful achievement in the human intellectual history. So it is for that reason that Kant is still very widely studied today. That Kantian moral philosophy is a very important part of your philosophy education. So alright, so I guess this is pretty much all I have to say about Hume and Kant for today. I have tried to cover a lot of ground within the last 20 or 30 minutes. It's probably not enough. I mean, because you can easily spend an entire semester studying either Hume or Kant. So please, take some time to, after you listen to this video, please take some time to read the relevant sections in the textbook and think about things on your own. And I'm sure you will find this to be a very rewarding and stimulating experience. Thank you.